Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 167, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/167. And today, joining me is Keith Knight. How's it going, bud?
It's going good. I'm sad that the CDC told me to take off my mask today, but I'll eventually be okay with parting with it. How are you doing?
You know, I was really inspired today when President Biden tweeted about how you either have to take the vaccine or wear a mask indefinitely. That really made me feel safe, and it made me feel like we have a wonderful leader who's going to lead us through this pandemic, Keith.
Well, same here because, he was always this, creepy groper tyrant. But then he reminds us that he'll either have us penetrated or he'll cover our mouth and stop us from breathing easily. So he really reminded us the role we as citizens have in our obedience to the state. So, yes, that's a great foundation for today's topic.
Well, praise be to him. So we are moving forward today. This is a really exciting episode, I think, because we're going to be talking about conspiracy theories today. And, it's interesting because you don't really have to be a nut whack job to believe in conspiracy theories. In fact, most of the conspiracies are freely admitted, and it's part of the public record. You just have to know where to look. So just starting us off, it's always good to start with the definition of what a conspiracy is, because a conspiracy has a real definition, and that actually supports the fact that conspiracies are very, very, very commonplace. So there is a legal definition, one being an agreement to perform together an illegal, wrongful, or subversive act between a group of conspirators, or you could also call it an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime or accomplish a legal purpose through illegal action. And to kind of aid us in our definition of conspiracy here, we have a kind of a research paper, a brief overview of federal conspiracy law. The link I'll try and remember to put in the show notes page here. But it says, almost every headline-grabbing prosecution has involved a conspiracy charge. Terrorists, drug traffickers, mafia members, and corrupt corporate executives have one thing in common. Most are conspirators subject to federal prosecution. So one thing that I was thinking in research that I'm doing for a piece on the Libertarian Institute was how politicians are in conspiracies all the time. They openly plot together to commit certain acts. Not all of them are illegal. From our perspective, a lot of them are illegal, but a lot of them are, to create war. And we'll be talking about a lot of that, in this episode coming up here. So, Keith, I understand that you know a bit of the history behind the term conspiracy theory itself.
Well, much like there is the origin of a term, the etymology, and then the definition, and then how it's used in, commonly spoken of today, there's actually a document from the Warren Commission in the 1960s, document 1035-960. I'm going to mention 3 sentences from this document, and it was titled Countering Criticism of the Warren Commission. Now, this is from the Central Intelligence Agency, the Warren Commission, these organizations, public service agencies here to inform us, let us know what just happened to our president. Here's how they speak behind closed doors. The aim of this dispatch is to provide material for countering and discrediting the claims of the conspiracy theorists so as to inhibit the circulation of such claims in other countries. Background information is supplied in a classified section and in a number of unclassified attachments. Point out, he said, that when discussing how to communicate to members of the media, to discuss the publicity problem with liaison and friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors, pointing out that the Warren Commission critics are without serious foundation and that further speculative discussion only plays into the hands of the opposition. So instead of addressing you on principle or addressing your facts, they'll say something like, oh, you're just playing into the hands of the Soviets today. You're just saying that because you are one of the racists. That's what Andrew Gilliam's whole campaign was against Ron DeSantis. He said, I'm not saying Ron DeSantis is a racist. I'm saying he plays into their hands and uses their talking points, and they support him. It's all the same thing with different titles. Document goes on. Point out also that parts of the conspiracy talk appear to be deliberately generated by communist propagandists. Urge them to use their influence to discourage unfounded and irresponsible speculation. So, communist propagandist is the ancient term that we now know as racist or bigot or conspiracy theorist. It was just a way of saying shut up and dismissing things irrationally. Finally, in private or media discussion not directed at any particular writer or in attacking publications which may be yet forthcoming, the following arguments should be useful. That should get you interested enough to maybe click on the link and look at the further arguments they think should be useful. However, it's not telling them to just cite the evidence, just look at the facts, state the science as they would today. There are actual conversations behind closed doors about how to communicate the idea to the people to feed them a story, not to say, well, wherever you are in the investigation, give them the facts that you have. It says, here's the narrative, here's how to communicate it. This is an actual document of people conspiring about how to perpetuate what we now know as the term conspiracy theory. So that's how it was popularized.
Yeah, and one thing that really always stands out to me is that, I kind of got into this because I was watching the Corbett Report. And one thing that Corbett talks about a lot is this concept of open source intelligence. But recently he's been underlining the fact that conspirators have been openly conspiring, and they state what their objectives are and what they want to attain and how they do it. And so, I'm going to start this discussion off. We're each going to be talking about 5 conspiracies. But I rely a lot upon the book that I've been reading recently, which is The Shadows of Power, The Council on Foreign Relations, and the American Decline by James Perloff. So you can get a good close-up here. So the Council on Foreign Relations is one of these groups that openly conspires about U.S. foreign policy. And I think their influence in the modern day is a bit more debatable. However, their influence on past American history has been incredibly incredibly influential, but also eyebrow raising. So my first conspiracy theory is the Council on Foreign Relations. So just a few quotes about the Council on Foreign Relations that I'll pull from James Perloff's book. Notable historians Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and David Halberstam have called the CFR, quote, a front organization for the heart of the American establishment and, quote, the establishment's unofficial club. Newsweek called the council's leaders, quote, the foreign policy establishment of the United States, and political journalist Richard Rovere referred to the CFR as, quote, a sort of presidium for that part of the establishment that guides our destiny as a nation. Now these are not just any man on the street. These aren't just Patrick McFarland talking here. This is very influential United States historians and journalists that are saying this about the CFR. So the CFR came about in the early 1920s, and they produce a journal called Foreign Affairs that they put out 5 times a year. And the articles in Foreign Affairs are very interesting. One thing that Perloff notes is that they often, not every article is about globalism, but they often push globalism as a solution to problems that are being faced by the United States and their foreign policies. So J.P. Morgan has been behind a lot of the figures in the CFR, and we'll get into a bit more of the shenanigans that they were up to back in the past. But one thing that I have learned about the CFR and what I think about it is that it's not necessarily that the CFR drives American policy. It's just that many of the most influential figures in American political structure are members of the CFR. And that continues to be the case. Antony Blinken is a member of the CFR. I don't think that Hillary Clinton was, but there's a famous quote by her talking about walking over to the CFR. She said, "I'm delighted to be here in these new headquarters." This is a July 16th, 2009 address to the CFR's Washington, D.C. satellite office. She said, "I'm delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have often been to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future." So, Keith, that's my first pick.
My first pick is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum theft. In the early morning hours of March 18th, 1990, 13 works of art were stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Guards admitted 2 young men posing as police officers responding to a disturbance call, and the thieves tied the guards up and looted the museum over the next hour. The case is unsolved. No arrests have been made. No works of arts have been recovered. The FBI has valued the haul at $500 million, and the museum is offering $10 million in reward for information leading to the arts recovery, the largest bounty ever offered by a private institution. Now, this is important because it's on Netflix. There's a great 6-part series, 4-part series on the theft, and it goes to show you a number of things. This happened March 18th, 1990, so it's been 31 years. There's 2 claims we often get with regards to conspiracies. People don't conspire. This is by definition a conspiracy. 2, even if they did, someone would have said something and no one could get away with it. They've gotten away with it. No one's been arrested. No one's been charged. Even after the Netflix documentary, they don't have the leads that they thought they would. This is the biggest art theft in American history. I don't know if it's a European history as well, but certainly, $500 million. So this goes to prove conspiracies happen and people can get away with it. After decades, people can not know about it. That's my first one.
Yeah, and that just makes me think of there was a show, Keith, that I did with Kyle Anzalone back when he still did Foreign Policy Focus, about how it's funny because a lot of conspiracies, especially these entrapment things with young Arab men that are shown U.S. war atrocity propaganda by the CIA and the FBI. It's funny because a lot of what they do is actually would have never happened without the help of the FBI and CIA. So my next one is Jekyll Island, which is the founding of the Federal Reserve. And James Perloff talks a lot about how CFR members and banking interests behind the CFR were responsible for the foundation of the Federal Reserve. A lot of us have heard, being libertarians and knowing about the Fed, we've heard about the conspiracy to start the Federal Reserve. So the CFR spent almost 2 years studying central banking in Europe. There was Senator Aldrich was influential in this. Paul Warburg, and top representatives of the Morgan and Rockefeller interests. This took place at Morgan's Hunting Club on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. There, the plan was formulated for America's central bank, what would come to be known as the Federal Reserve. One of those in attendance at Jekyll Island was Frank Vanderlip, president of the Rockefeller's National City Bank. 25 years later, Vanderlip wrote in the Saturday Evening Post, so this is his own words about this conspiracy. There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. He uses the word. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the terminal of the New Jersey littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness attached to the rear end of the train for the South. Once aboard the private car, we began to observe the taboo that had been fixed on last names. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. After the Jekyll Island meeting, Senator Aldrich proposed the plan to Congress. His connections to the banking establishment raised enough suspicion that the Aldrich bill did not pass, but a similar measure under another name was subsequently pushed through. The Federal Reserve became law in December of 1913, 3 years later. Ostensibly, the system was to act as guardian of the reserves for a bank. It was granted control over the interest rates and the size of the national money supply. So we kind of know the rest of the story here, but that's my second conspiracy theory. Keith?
My next one is a gentleman named Elihu Ben Shaul Cohen, born December of 1924, died by hanging of the Syrian government May 18th, 1965. Commonly known as Eli Cohen, was an Israeli spy. He is best known for his espionage work in 1961 to 1965 in Syria, where he developed close relationships with the Syrian political and military hierarchy and became the chief advisor to the Minister of Defense. Syrian counterintelligence eventually uncovered the spy conspiracy and convicted Cohen under pre-war martial law, sentencing him to death and hanging publicly in 1965. A great book was written titled Our Man in Damascus, meaning Israel had a man in Syria, feeding them information. The book is so good, and it's really short. So let me just give you a quote from chapter 8. This is how the Israeli agent was able to get information from the other country back to Israel. Chapter 8, entertaining the Syrian top brass. Eli Cohen says, "Tell her she fascinates you. Tell her about your army adventures, your many connections, if you have any. Those girls love to hear secrets from a military man. It gives them a feeling of self-importance. When they're convinced that you trust them, they just give in, just like that." Salim, the military officer, opened his eyes wide. This is exactly what you would think the Jeffrey Epstein situation was. You had a guy who was hired by the Mossad, who was sent to Syria in order with tons of money, unlimited amounts of money. He poses as a philanthropist and businessman who it's really hard to discover the origins of his wealth. He starts having all these parties and bringing in the top Syrian officials and becomes friends with them, gets information, and is sending it to Israel. Now, that doesn't mean Epstein is exactly that. The point is that it's justified to be suspect about Epstein simply because we have an exact example historically of this happening. So it's one thing to say, no, Epstein does not apply to that, but it's wrong to say, no, that's ridiculous, that could never happen. The question is not, is it happening? The question is it happening again? That's all I got.
So I wanted to ask you, Keith, now you have had a larger episode about that book, right?
Yes, I did it had to have been an hour and a half, probably 6 months ago.
Okay, yep, and I'll have to link to that on the show notes page. But can I ask you, what tipped you off to that book in this issue?
Gosh, I really don't know. I think I was, my grandpa was actually a Zionist. My family's Jewish, and he actually sent a letter to John McCain asking him, because my grandpa knew about the Levon affair of 1954. My grandpa knew about the USS Liberty. He was sort of in the know. And he sent a letter to John McCain asking whether he thinks Israel is really a close ally. And McCain's office actually sent back a letter saying, yeah, we really think Israel is a close ally, and we really don't think that they were behind any recent attacks in America. I don't have a date on the letter. I don't know if it was in 93 from the original World Trade Center bombing or from 2001. We just found it in his archive, in my grandfather's papers. So as I'm looking through those, he had this book called Our Man in Damascus, and I read through it. It was just unreal. The amount of similarities between the Epstein case and the Cohen case, it's just mind-blowing. So my grandpa's how I came across it.
That's incredible. I'm so glad I asked you. Did I ever tell you the story of my grandpa, the John Bircher?
No.
So my grandpa was in the John Birch Society, and I think I talked about this when I had Scott on my show. But my grandpa was in the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society was actually started in Appleton, Wisconsin, I believe in the 50s. And my grandpa lived in Appleton, I think, or kind of around there in central Wisconsin. So I don't know, he died when I was 1.5 years old, and my mom she wasn't a Bircher and she wasn't really in the know. He made her read How I Found Freedom in an Unfree World when she was a teenager.
Really?
Yeah. So
wow, that's interesting. So he had to have been a libertarian if he's reading Harry Brown.
I think he was from what I understand, he was a bit more of a paleo, but he wrote an op-ed against the first Iraq War, and published that, talking about how the Bushes were involved in oil interests and all this kind of stuff, and how we conservatives won't be fooled like we were fooled in Vietnam.
Interesting.
So I have that clipping from the op-ed he wrote, so I like to think that I'm making him proud. That's what keeps me going. So I would give anything to have 2 hours with him to talk.
Oh, me too. Me too.
So my third conspiracy theory is the Council on Foreign Relations in Germany and the United States banking interests funding the Nazi war machine. And I think this is really interesting because there were CFR members that were intimately involved in the restructuring of the German debt after World War I. So the Treaty of Versailles set up this huge reparations plan amongst the Allied powers. The Treaty of Versailles set up a commission to oversee the reparations to be repaid to the Allied powers from Germany. And so soon after that was in place, a few years later, the Germans, of course, inflated their currency because they couldn't keep up with the debt obligations. And they famously, the Weimar Republic went into hyperinflation. Wheelbarrowfuls of money could not buy a book of matches. And so there were members of United States banking interests that were put on the reparations committee to reform the debt payments from Germany to the Allies. There was a plan that came out called the Dawes Plan, was the first plan. And essentially what would happen is that Wall Street would be making huge loans and there would be some financial trickery, financial poof that happened. And these banking interests would lend money to Germany, and Germany would repay, I think, Britain, and it would go on. And essentially they'd be able to pay back the debt. So that Dawes Plan went forward, but the leader of that, Charles Dawes, was eventually a member of the CFR. So Charles Dawes was a banker from the United States, and Owen Young was another banker from the United States, a lawyer and a businessman, who were members. Young was a member of the CFR. Dawes would later become a member of the CFR. But there are papers in Foreign Affairs talking about how the Dawes and Young plans would not have happened without their involvement. Of course, it's their namesake, but it also says it wouldn't have happened because they wielded so much influence on the reparations committee that they basically dictated what the whole plan was. So Carroll Quigley, who is a name that should be very familiar to people, who was Bill Clinton's. Do you remember which university Carroll Quigley taught at? Was it Princeton?
Georgetown University.
It was Georgetown, and he mentored Bill Clinton. He wrote, "It is worthy of note that this system was set up by the international bankers and that the subsequent lending of other people's money to Germany was very profitable to these bankers." David Lloyd George, who was British Prime Minister from 1916 to 1922, said, "The international bankers dictated the Dawes reparations settlement. They swept statesmen, politicians, and journalists to one side and issued their orders with the imperiousness of absolute monarchs who knew that there was no appeal from their ruthless decrees." So what happened later is that all of this money that was being loaned to Germany ended up creating chemical enterprise IG Farben and a whole bunch of other industries in Germany that ended up being the backbone of the Nazi war machine. And there's a bit more shenanigans that goes into it, but for the sake of brevity on this one, there was an investigation after World War II by the U.S. War Department, which concluded that without IG Farben's immense productive facilities, its intense research, and vast international affiliations, Germany's prosecution of the war would have been unthinkable and impossible. So I think that's pretty damning. And all of this comes from the CFR and Owen Young and Charles Dawes. They're conspiring with the CFR to push forward this agenda. I'll end on this. IG Farben was the company that manufactured the Zyklon B, which exterminated the Jews. So big conspiracy there. But anyways, Keith, I'll hand it back to you.
And also the Trading of the Enemy Act of 1917, Prescott Bush and Union Banking were actually ransacked under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And now, if you look at Prescott Bush, this is a little more theoretical, but not totally. He was a Skull and Bones member, as was Henry Stimson, and both of them, we have cases, especially Stimson, of creating what is known as problem reaction solution in these societies as, well, we want X to be the outcome. So in order for us to have an outcome, we have to be part of the solution that gives us an outcome. And to need a solution to get popular support, we first need a problem. So they actively have an understanding that they are to create a problem so they could usher in a reaction and a solution. So, certainly, what we spent 3 years trying to see if, Trump had ties to Russia. Meanwhile, the Bush crime family not only did business with bin Laden construction, but also with National Socialist Germany. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's an example of free trade, but there's a little too much overlap, and it's why it's dangerous for there to be a state for people in positions of power to get funding and any acquisition of influence without actual consent or voluntary contracts. My next one is National Security Study Memorandum 200. National Security Study Memorandum 200, Implications of Worldwide Population Growth for U.S. Security and Overseas Interests, NSSM 200, was completed on December 10th, 1974, by the United States National Security Council under the direction of Henry Kissinger. It was adopted as official U.S. policy by U.S. President Gerald Ford in November 1975. It was classified for a while, but was obtained by researchers in the early 1990s. Again, the idea that things can't stay under wraps. It's been under wraps since the 90s. And even since it's been discovered, most people don't know about it because there is a media who believes in the religion of statism. And just as Catholics won't throw their religion under the bus, the religion of progressivism and statism will follow the same paths. Here are some of the findings. The basic thesis of the memorandum was that population growth in the least developed countries, LDCs, is a concern to U.S. national security because it would tend to risk civil unrest and political instability in countries that had a high potential for economic development. The policy gives paramount importance to population control measures and the promotion of contraception among 13 populous countries to control rapid population growth, which the U.S. deems inimical to social, political, and economic growth in these countries and to the national interests of the United States, since the U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of minerals from abroad, and the countries can produce destabilizing opposition forces against the U.S. It recommends that U.S. leadership influence national leaders, quote, and that improved worldwide support for population-related efforts should be sought through increased emphasis on mass media and other population education and motivation programs by the United Nations, USIA, and USAID. Named countries, 13 countries are named in the report as particularly problematic with respect to U.S. security interests. India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, Turkey, Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. These countries are projected to create 47% of all world population growth. So the idea that, population control is not something actively being discussed behind closed doors by the powerful, that's verifiably false, one. And two, it's actually not just something in the 70s or something Thomas Malthus did centuries ago. Even as recently as the Obama administration, who had John P. Holdren, who was the author of Ecoscience, which talked about, putting things in water and, engaged in a forced sterilization of some men and women in order to, regulate the population of America. So if you justify it against those 13 countries, just wait, it's coming to you. And second of all, any power you give the state to regulate under the guise of the greater good, well, watch out, because they are going to stretch that until it's not just, oh, those dumb hippies, or it's just the business owners, or it's just the blacks, or it's just the men. It's going to be you eventually, or your kids. Either way, it's unjustified and they can't be trusted with it.
I've heard conservatives joke about how we need eugenics and population control to prevent dumb people from having children. Have you heard this, like welfare people from having more kids and burning the system? And
yeah, I know Adam Carolla used to say it on Loveline. I'm not sure how serious they are, just because even if you could get it, again, it's going to be used against you.
Right, yeah. And I don't think they're serious. They say it in passing. But they wouldn't say it if they weren't like some percentage serious about it. And I had this buddy in law school who said something like that. And I was like, hey, bud, like, let me tell you that sentiment is real. And let me tell you that it's a big club and you are definitely not in it.
Yeah.
So that reminds me of, Corbett Report's Big Oil series and how he talks about that UN said Earth Summit in 1992. We talked about this on the episode with Kyle Anzalone we did a little while back, but talking about the bankers coming together and talking about literally, quote, the cannon fodder, unfortunately, that populates the earth. So anyways, my next conspiracy theory, number 4, is Pearl Harbor and foreknowledge by the United States of Pearl Harbor. American military intelligence had cracked the radio code Tokyo used to communicate with its embassies. As a result, Japanese diplomatic messages in 1941 were known to Washington, often on a same-day basis. The decoded intercepts revealed that spies in Hawaii were informing Tokyo of the precise locations of the U.S. warships docked in Pearl Harbor. Collectively, the messages suggested an assault would come on or about December 7th. These intercepts were routinely sent to the president and to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. In addition, separate warnings about the attack with varying specificity as to its time were transmitted to these two men by or through various officials, including Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, Senator Guy Gillette, who was acting on a tip from the Korean underground, Congressman Martin Dies, Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, the U.S. military observer in Java, Colonel F.G.L. Wiedgerman, the Dutch military attaché in Washington, and other sources. Captain Johan Raneft, the Dutch naval attaché in Washington, recorded that U.S. naval intelligence officers told him on December 6th that Japanese carriers were only 400 miles north of Honolulu. Not only that, but the fact that Winston Churchill and FDR conspired to bring the United States into war and discussed whether or not we should start a war between whether or not Germany would be the one to lure us in or whether or not it would be Japan. Here's a quote from Ralph Raico's book. I believe it's called Great Leaders. I don't have it in front of me, but after a talk with Churchill, Joseph Kennedy, American ambassador to Britain, noted, quote, every hour we will be spent by the British in trying to figure out how we can be gotten in. When he left from Lisbon on a ship to New York, Kennedy pleaded with the State Department to announce that if the ship should happen to blow up mysteriously in the mid-Atlantic, the United States would not consider it a cause for war with Germany. In his unpublished memoirs, Kennedy wrote, quote, I thought that would give me some protection against Churchill's placing a bomb on the ship. Can you believe that?
Yeah, there's certainly exact times where, gosh, what was it? There was a movie called with Benedict Cumberbatch. It was about the Enigma codes,
Yeah.
and they're like explicitly talking about staging attacks where they're like, all right, we're going to send these soldiers into war. We know they're going to die because we've cracked the German Enigma code, but it'll be better for the greater good. So realize that there's always this justification in the back of their mind. There's always this Madeleine Albright, Osama bin Laden idea of, well, yes, I actively engage in murdering innocent people. However, this is justified because, decades from now, millions of people will decide to do things that I have no clue about. So, yeah, this is the idea of that some people own the bodies of others
Yeah.
because in the long run, it'll be greater.
And if you'll indulge me a little bit, Keith, sorry, I got more juicy quotes here. So no wonder that this is Ralph Raico again. No wonder that in the House of Commons on February 15th, 1942, Churchill declared of America's entry into the war, quote, "This is what I have dreamed of, aimed at, worked for, and now it has come to pass." I mean, what an admission of conspiracy. And he goes on, but Churchill did not neglect, quote, "the back door to war, embroiling the United States with Japan as a way of bringing America into the conflict with Hitler. Sir Robert Craigie, the British ambassador to Tokyo, like the American ambassador Joseph Grew, was working feverishly to avoid war. Churchill directed his foreign secretary, Anthony Eden, to whip Craigie into line. He should surely be told forthwith that the entry of the United States into war, either with Germany and Italy or war with Japan, is fully conformable with British interest. Nothing in the munition sphere can compare with the importance of the British Empire and the United States being co-belligerent." So, yeah, that's what I got. So that is my fourth conspiracy, Keith.
Well, not to mention, there's a U.S. document from Arthur McCullum, 8 ways to get the Japanese to attack, one of which was implemented called the Export Control Act of 1940. And Churchill mentioned in his own diaries that he tried to get Roosevelt into the war as early as August of 1940. So certainly tons of evidence there. Henry Stimson, quoted by John Toland in his book Infamy. Stimson was the Secretary of War at the time, talking about how he was sort of disappointed about the attack at Pearl Harbor, but finally relieved because now they have national support behind them. So this is constantly happening, and we know this because there's the incentive. As Milton Friedman always said, whenever something bad happens in the private sector, people lose their jobs and sometimes you go out of business. Whenever something bad happens in the public sector, their funding triples
They get
for some reason. So what is the incentive? Even if you get the nicest people in there by some miracle of Jesus Christ, you're still going to have the voice in the back of their head saying more power, etc.
And that's sorry, Keith. Great leaders and Great Wars and Great Leaders by Ralph Raico. I was
a libertarian rebuttal.
Libertarian rebuttal, yeah. So there you go, the great Ralph Raico.
Rest in peace. Operation Mockingbird, my fourth, an alleged large-scale program of the United States Central Intelligence Agency that began in the early years of the Cold War and attempted to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. As we mentioned at the beginning, they openly have discussions about how they're going to use the media, which they already clearly have access to. According to author Deborah Davis, Operation Mockingbird recruited leading American journalists into a propaganda network and influenced the operations of front groups. CIA support of front groups was exposed in a 1967 Ramparts magazine article reported that the National Student Association received funding from the CIA. In 1975, the Church Committee Congressional Investigations revealed agency connections with journalists and civic groups. None of the reports, however, mentioned by name in Operation Mockingbird coordinating or supporting these activities. So, just as the FBI in COINTELPRO and PATCON, CIA is constantly infiltrating groups, causing causing trouble, causing a justification for their own existence. Obama, I think, said it perfectly in his book A Promised Land. He calls it, oh my God, the pretzel-like logic of American foreign policy. So in order to justify further movement, it's justified by previous movement, which justifies later movement, which is justified because earlier things that were done. So it's all intertwined. And I think I still haven't come across a better explanation than Obama in his book, the Promised Land. That is my fourth one.
Like fighting a war in Iraq to benefit Iran and the Shias.
When you earlier armed Saddam to fight the Iranians and Rumsfeld shook hands with Saddam.
So here's another example that's even different than the one I just mused about. So here's my fifth one: is the United States supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1970s and 80s, late 70s and 80s. This is Michel Chossudovsky's book, America's War on Terrorism. He writes, in 1979, the largest covert operation in the history of the CIA was launched in Afghanistan. Quote, with the active encouragement of the CIA and Pakistan's ISI, who wanted to turn the Afghan jihad into a global war waged by all Muslim states against the Soviet Union, some 35,000 Muslim radicals from 40 Islamic countries joined Afghanistan's fight between 1982 and 1992. Tens of thousands more came to study in Pakistani madrasas. Eventually, more than 100,000 foreign Muslim radicals were directly influenced by the Afghan jihad. U.S. government support to the Mujahideen was presented to world public opinion as, quote, a necessary response to the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in support of the pro-communist government of Barack Kemal. Recent evidence suggests, however, that the CIA's military intelligence operation in Afghanistan had been launched prior rather than in response to the Soviet invasion. Washington's intent was to deliberately trigger a civil war which lasted more than 20 years and killed 1 million people. The CIA's role in support of the Mujahideen is confirmed in a 1998 interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who at the time was National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. Brzezinski says, according to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980, that is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on 24th December 1979, but the reality secretly guarded until now is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979 that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. Question: despite this risk, you were an advocate of this covert action, but perhaps you yourself desired the Soviet entry into war and looked to provoke it. Brzezinski: it isn't quite that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Question: when the Soviets justified their intervention by asserting that they intended to fight against the secret involvement of the United States in Afghanistan, people did not believe them. However, there was a basis of truth. You don't regret anything today? Brzezinski says, regret what? The secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap, and you want me to regret it? The day that the Soviets officially crossed the border, I wrote to President Carter, we now have the opportunity of giving to the USSR its Vietnam War. Indeed, for almost 10 years, Moscow had to carry on a war unsupportable by the government, a conflict that brought about the demoralization and finally the breakup of the Soviet Empire. Debatable. And neither do you regret having supported the Islamic fundamentalists, having given arms and advice to future terrorists. Brzezinski: what is most important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? Question mark. So there you have it.
Yeah. And of course, we can debate whether that was what took them down, whether it was still justified. Look at how they talk about millions of innocent people. They're like, we could give them their Vietnam. Okay, Vietnam was terrible. Millions of slaves, millions of deaths, millions of people's lives ruined. God knows how much in property destruction, God knows how much PTSD, and what people with PTSD, how they negatively affected other people. So this is why Brzezinski called his book The Grand Chessboard. He quite literally sees people as pawns in a game of chess. If you want to look up the document where they actually talk about it in July of 79, 6 months before the Soviet invasion, you can check out scotthorton.org/fair use. And you can actually read the words because it's an actual example of, you can't get out of this one. There's no explaining this one away as to, well, it wasn't existent. These things actually happen behind closed doors. They talk about how they're going to do things that they know are going to cause millions of people to die. You can't get around that. Of course, you can always rationalize everything. Speaking of rationalizations, Executive Order 610-6102. An executive order signed on April 5th, 1933 by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt forbidding the hoarding of gold, coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. Okay, first of all, it's already wrong, because what happened was the state confiscated it, and what did they do? They didn't have it spinning in a, one of those mouse things that they just run in. It was being hoarded. This was just an open theft on a large scale. The executive order was made under the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Just as conservatives are like, well, we got to stop trading with the enemy. You are the enemy sooner or later. We got to put the terrorists on the no-fly list. Hey, Nick Fuentes, guess where you're not flying to? As amended by the Emergency Banking Act in March 1933. Anytime you give them access to an industry, you're signing up to get screwed. The limitation on gold ownership in the United States was repealed after President Gerald Ford signed a bill legalizing private ownership of gold coins, bars, and certificates by an act of Congress, codified Pub 93-373, which went into effect December 31st, 1974. So President Ford, after Richard Nixon took America off the gold standard. So completely meaningless. They confiscate the gold, reap the benefits, take us off the gold standard. The stated reason for the order was that hard times had caused hoarding of gold, stalling economic growth, and worsened the Depression. Now, they're always going to have these examples. There's unrest in the Middle East. There is unrest everywhere all the time. In America, BLM and Antifa constantly looting. There's constant unrest anywhere. So the idea that, well, no, there were bad economic conditions. If you give them such vague concepts, they're always going to use them as a justification to increase the power that they already want to have. On April 6, 1933, the New York Times wrote, under the headline, Hoarding of Gold, the executive order issued by the president yesterday amplifies his earlier warnings against hoarding. They're still using that term today, as though hoarding is a bad thing, while they tell us that the environment is going to hell because people spend and consume too much. All right, I'll save and I'll postpone consumption. No, that's hoarding. All right. Is there anything I can do that won't justify the state increasing its power? On March 6th, taking advantage of a wartime statute that had not been repealed, he issued Presidential Proclamation 2039 that forbade the hoarding of gold or silver coin or bullion of currency under penalty of $10,000 or up to 5 to 10 years imprisonment. Here is Richard Nixon's speech, August 15th, 1971. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the American dollar except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. That's a 9.5 out of 10 on the Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone propaganda scale. I have directed, assumes the president has the right to rule. Secretary Connally, so you can't hold him accountable. He's been directed to do so, to suspend a word that we get in school where this is a suspension. This is nothing long term. It's just a temporary measure temporarily, of course. So don't get all upset. It's just temporary. You're freaking out. The convertibility of the American dollar, except in amounts and conditions determined. I'm sorry, by who? To be in the interest of who? Of monetary stability. Well, then you would abolish the Federal Reserve because the dollar has lost its stability, and in the best interest of the United States, country with hundreds of millions of people. I mean, that line is so propaganda ridden that I think it's one of the best I've seen outside of, Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays and probably Barack Obama. So those are my 5.
I thought you were going to do your Nixon voice. I didn't know if you had a Nixon voice, but you have some good voices you do.
You know what? I think I need at least a quarter of Jack Daniel's bottle in order for me to even attempt at a Nixon, Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin.
What about voice. Jim Beam?
Some Jim. You know what? Yes, you could probably Venmo me some Jim Beam.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed this episode, Keith. It's always good to do some conspiracy talk with you. I know I've been meaning to do it. I think we've dabbled a little bit, but I've been meaning to really dive into it for some time. So maybe we'll have to reprise this because God knows there's more than 10 conspiracies out there that we can tackle.
There have been more than 10 since we started this discussion. As you mentioned, it's all terrorism, all mafia, all gangs, all corruption. Is more than one people acting in accordance or having some sort of meeting of the minds to do something illegal, immoral, unjustified. So yeah, definitely glad we did. You are going to be at Childerberg. So if where it's in Texas, right?
Yeah, it's outside of Austin, and I think it's something horseshoe, something recreation area. Go to Childerberg.
Hey, Patrick's going to be at Childerberg, so if you want to go, meet him there. Take selfies and send them.
Yeah, I would be more than glad to talk to you and hang out and take selfies. That sounds great. Childerberg.com, BURG. You can get get all the info there. So, Keith, where can people find your work?
Odyssey.com. Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and YouTube as of now.
Okay, yep, and you can find my work on Odyssey. I do exclusive Odyssey videos there. You can't find anywhere else. So check me out there. Also, we are both on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. You can find our work there. libertyweekly.net, and that's about it. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed this one. Peace.
Take care.